The question of whether the US and maybe some other NATO allies will give military support to Ukraine is something that has become very, very important in the last week or so. There's a growing pressure across the political spectrum in the US and in both houses of the US Congress for President Barack Obama to do this. A number of senior former ambassadors and members of the US State Department published a major paper after visiting Ukraine and NATO this week. It was published by the Atlantic Council of the US, where they argued in favor of Ukraine being granted some defensive weaponry. And the argument is quite strong in terms of a number of factors. Firstly, there's a need to create some kind of level playing field. There was to some degree that in the summer when Ukrainian forces were fighting just really the separatists, and Ukraine was on the verge, even though Ukraine armed forces and National Guard were still in the process of evolving and being created and being improved, Ukraine was on the verge of defeating them until Russia invaded in August. But what we are talking about today is that since that Russian invasion, which was led to the Minsk peace accords in September, Russia has sent in a massive flow of high-tech equipment, volunteers and troops and trainers, intelligence officers into eastern Ukraine. And this has created a disbalance with the Ukrainian forces holding on very bravely, but also in a very precarious situation. And with the separatists now with a lot of bravado talking about raising an army of 100,000, I don't think that's possible, and also to retake back the whole of Donbas. After all, they only control a third of the Donbas territory. So the supplying of defensive weaponry, training and advice could hope to recreate some kind of level playing field, some kind of balance on the ground, and then force Russia to back off from seeking a military option and force it to maybe undertake more seriously the negotiation option. The view of the realist school, the Mearsheimers and others, that Russia should, that the negotiation option should be the main one pursued, doesn't work unless there's some muscle behind it, forcing the Russians to the table, whether it's economic sanctions, which have been pretty weak until now and they could be easily improved, such as the argument made by The Guardian yesterday that Russia should be cut off from the SWIFT international payment system, which had severely impact upon Russia's banking and credit system, but also the military option. The comparison is made with Yugoslavia and Bosnia in the 1990s. Slobodan Milosovic did not go to Dayton, did not go to negotiations until NATO intervened militarily. And the similar argument could be made today. Of course, Serbia is a different animal to Russia. Russia is a far more cruel and nuclear power, but both were mafia states, and both understand that they can't take on the US and the West and NATO. So that would be another reason for providing the arms. But we should be looking at the different potential options that Ukraine has. And those have remained similar to what I wrote about now 4 or 5 months ago. And they really are to either capitulate, consolidate, or continue with the war. The capitulation argument is that one really made by maybe a few West European countries. It's difficult to say. They've been very tight-lipped on negotiations taking place in Kyiv and Moscow. But certainly by the kind of minority of Western analysts who are in the realist schools, such as Professor Mearsheimer, who say that the Ukrainians cannot be really outside Russia's sphere of influence and that they should just agree to Russia's demands, particularly the issue of federalism for the country, greater autonomy for the Donbas, and to say no, they do not want to join NATO and the EU. So some kind of Findlandization, in effect. So that would be capitulation. I just don't see how any Ukrainian leader, even Petro Poroshenko, who is really a moderate by instinct, could sell this in Kyiv, particularly with Ukraine, which has a parliamentary system of government, and where you have a very pro-European constitutional majority and a very small pro-Russian lobby in the Ukrainian parliament. So even if Petro Poroshenko wanted to, and I don't think he does, he couldn't sell that. So what are we left with? The two options. Maybe they're not necessarily incompatible. Ukraine does need military support from the West. After all, it has a moral impediment to argue that. It did give away the world's third largest nuclear weapons in 1994, which led to the signing of the Budapest Memorandum. The US, Britain in particular, forget Russia, which has torn up that memorandum, but Britain and the US in particular gave Ukraine guarantees in return for which Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons. So there is a moral argument that Ukraine can make to those two countries that, hey, come on, today we used to be a nuclear power, we're not anymore, give us some support. And we're talking about limited amounts of defensive weaponry, such as the Javelin anti-tank handheld weapon, training and advice. Can you send these to corrupt? Yes, you can send them to corrupt countries. We do that all the time. We've been sending weaponry to Egypt. Egypt is the second largest recipient of US aid for the last 30 years. We send weaponry to Pakistan. We send it to Iraq and Afghanistan. We also have troops on the ground giving training. So if we can send it to those corrupt countries, why can't we send it to Ukraine? And that would at least give the Ukrainians the ability to adopt a more defensive posture against a guerrilla terrorist army for the separatists, which has received a massive influx of Russian weaponry. But there's, I think, and it's something that, of course, President Poroshenko cannot talk about openly, but it's bound to be becoming more and more something that Ukrainians are going to be talking about in their kitchens and in their bars. And that is the question of consolidation. What do I mean by that? Well, if defensive weaponry is not sent by Barack Obama, and this is a president who is probably the weakest since Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. Probably Jimmy Carter was stronger than Obama. And he's going against the grain of both his own party and the Republicans and public opinion in the US. But if the West doesn't send weaponry and Ukraine is pushed by the Europeans who are playing the good cop to the American bad cop routine towards the capitulation option of federalism and saying no to European and NATO integration, well, maybe the option is really only to go for consolidation. We have the irony is that the separatist leaders in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region, actually don't want to be part of Ukraine. They want to be part of Russia. It's only the Russian leadership which say, stay inside Ukraine because you're my leverage with Kyiv. There's quite a few people in Ukraine who would agree with them, particularly in West Ukraine, by the way. A week or so ago, Ukrainian officials released statistics about the number of people who volunteered to come up for conscription. I mean, they called to come to the conscription office, but they're not dragged there. They have to come voluntarily to the office. And the highest turnout of close to 100% of people turning up who were called up was in eastern and southern Ukraine, so Russian speakers, ironically. You know where the lowest one was? Western Ukraine. So the so-called nationalistic anti-Russian region of Western Ukraine had the lowest turnout for people turning up for conscription duties in the Ukrainian military. Why is that? It's not because they're not patriotic. Of course they're patriotic. They're extremely patriotic. And they will die for, willing to die for Ukraine. It's because they don't see necessarily the point in sending their kids, husbands, sons, brothers, uncles, to die for the Donbas, to keep the Donbas in Ukraine. That's the reason. They don't see the point of it. So that argument, if Ukraine is forced with the choice of either federalism and Findlandization and being basically a Russian puppet state, or saying to hell with the Donbas, if Russia wants it so badly it should take it, which is what the separatists want after all, then maybe the best option is to do that, is to cut off the bad arm to save the rest of the country. That might sound extreme, but think about it. Even if Ukraine, with defensive weaponry from the West, is able to knock out the separatists, to retake back the Donbas, if Russia say we can't commit more troops, we're pulling out. Let's assume that happens. If that happens, then Ukraine has two problems already. It has to pay billions of dollars, I don't know if it's trillions of dollars, to rebuild the Donbas, which has been destroyed. In the last month or so, the separatists and the Russians have been deliberately, as a way to try and defeat the Ukrainians and get them out, it's just to level whole towns, like Debaltseve has been leveled, or the Donetsk airport. The only way to get the Ukrainians out was just to level it. You would have to spend trillions of dollars when Ukraine doesn't have that money. Secondly, you've got to deal with the people on the ground. And those people who have left there, the pro-Ukrainians in the Donbass have already gone west. The ones who are left have been believing Russian TV propaganda. They've been believing rumors. In today's Guardian, there was a report from Kramatorsk in the Donbass where they continue to believe that Ukrainian forces, which ruled the town in August and September, did a mass murder, and the bodies were allegedly found in a pit. Allegedly, 80 bodies were found. In fact, the OSCE, after it investigated, found 4 bodies which were killed in a firefight. But the locals believe what is on Russian TV. And believe you me, Goebbels would learn a lot from what is shown on Russian TV today. I received daily reviews from the BBC of what is said on Russian TV. It puts your hair on end. And so you would have to not only deal with rebuilding the Donbass, costing you trillions, but you have to also deal with the people on the ground and try and change them into being pro-Ukrainian again. Or you're going to be looking over your shoulder all the time, as the Ukrainians are already doing on the ground. By the way, many of the people who are the spotters for incoming Russian artillery and Grad rockets are local people working out of their own apartments. This was true of the Mariupol attacks just a week or so ago. So, yes, Ukraine should receive defensive weaponry from the West. Yes, it should receive training and advice. That's key to transforming a moribund neo-Soviet armed forces and the newly emerging National Guard into professional European fighting force that can deal with both an invasion and counterinsurgency. But at the same time, we have to maybe believe down the road that that is the Donbass worth keeping inside Ukraine if it means that keeping the Donbass would require Ukraine to become a puppet state of Russia, some kind of Finlandized puppet state, with no option of integration westwards or otherwise. And that is something I just don't think many Ukrainians will accept. And I wonder whether, if an opinion poll was held, a survey was held inside Ukraine today of what to do, I'm sure that particularly in West Ukraine, many people would say, you know, if Putin wants the Donbass so much, let him take it. Of course, there are dangers. There are dangers with doing any of these potential options. The danger is, as you hear often in Ukraine, is that even if you give the Donbass, say to hell with the Donbass, take it, Putin won't stop. He'll then go for Kharkiv or Odesa or elsewhere. But this is where it's true, you can't trust a word that's coming out of Moscow. At the same time, if defensive weaponry comes to Ukraine, if you have a new SBU, security service, if you have a new National Guard, a more improved military, plus local civil defense forces on the ground. We have to remember that support for separatism in Kharkiv and Odesa, which were the two swing regions in the spring of last year, is actually very minimal. Russia would not have that support. One reason why Russia was able to get into the Donbas was not only because it was a party region stronghold, but also because there was, at the time in the spring of last year, something about 33% of the local population supported the separation of the Donbas to Russia. So in that sense, the Donbas was very similar to the Crimea, where it was about 40%. Never a majority in both regions, but nevertheless, this was an aggressive minority when you had a passive majority in both places. In the Kharkiv and Odesa, we're talking about less than 5% support for separatism. So Russia wouldn't be able to fulfill its objectives in those regions, even if it wanted to. But a more difficult question, in my view, would be which part of Donbas would go to Russia. Because I was in Donbas in the western region, Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, in December. This region of western and southern Donetsk and northern Luhansk is actually very anti-separatist. So you would maybe have to redraw the boundaries of the Donbas, and that's again a very difficult question to deal with, probably the most difficult question of what to do. But to think that even if Ukraine receives Western military assistance, it can take on the separatists and Russians, it can create some kind of level playing field, but Russia is always going to be 3 times as big as Ukraine. Russia's always going to have far, far bigger armed forces. And it's not going to be possible if Russia commits a lot more forces for Ukraine to defeat the whole of Russia. So greater Western support for Ukraine's security forces will allow them to hold the line, to maybe push back the separatists, but it's not going to allow them to defeat Russia as a military power. And NATO is not going to intervene in the same way as it intervened with bombing attacks and sorties against Slobodan Milosovic. So the options for Ukraine are very difficult. It has 2 fronts: external, fighting with Russian-backed separatism and terrorism; internal, economic, financial corruption. The two are very much intertwined, because it's very difficult to deal with those domestic reforms and fighting corruption and financial problems when you have a conflict on your territory. The IMF, on whose money Ukraine is dependent, does not normally give assistance to countries who are at war. So we have this fiction that Ukraine is not at war with Russia, when it really is, and hence it's still called an anti-terrorist operation. But de facto, Ukraine is at war with Russia. 80% of Ukrainians believe that. So this is extremely complicated, has many, many different angles. Capitulation is not something Ukrainians will accept. So tough luck, realists, like Professor Mearsheimer. But at the same time, the other 2 options of war and consolidation, maybe Ukraine without the Donbas and Crimea, are going to be more and more on the cards. And Ukraine, without its 2 most pro-Russian regions, without the headache of Putin-backed terrorists, might be a country that can eventually move forward. But if this continues as it is, Ukraine could be at war for a long time. Proxy wars of this nature can go on for decades. And we know that Putin is not just after, really, the Donbas. He's trying to destroy, through the Donbas, Ukrainian independence. And that's something that Ukrainians should think about when they make their decisions. Thank you.